In today's episode, I'm very happy to welcome here in Oslo the head of the PEFA Secretariat, Srinivas Gurazada, and to gauge his views and opinion on the current state of affairs in public financial management, and especially I would be very interested to know about what he thinks about how those trends in public financial management impact the world of Supreme Audit Institutions and their work. Srini, I'm really happy and thankful that you managed to find the time in your very busy schedule this week to also drop by our studio and to record with us this podcast on the PEFA assessment and the public financial management state of affairs, if I can say so. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work and also what PEFA actually stands for?
Thanks, Dafina. Wonderful being here on your podcast. IDI is doing great job in organizing this and taking the messages out. I'm Srinivas Gurazada, head of PEFA Secretariat, based out of Washington, D.C. I'm here in this beautiful city, Oslo, for the PEFA Steering Committee meeting. So, Norway has been one of the founding members of PEFA that I would a bit later explain, and that's the reason why I'm here. So, Norway hosted the PEFA Steering Committee meeting this round, and we had wonderful last few days discussing various issues on public financial management and how to strengthen them. PEFA is public expenditure and financial accountability, and that's where I work. And it's public financial management. What is it? What does that really mean? Let me take you back to my own story. Everyone knows that money is important. You agree? Money is important.
Absolutely.
Governments also need money. That's important. And they need to spend money well. And how do we make sure that governments spend money well? Each government, how does it make sure? So I started off as in the private sector in my initial parts of my career in India and quickly moved into Government of India, where I worked in Ministry of Finance and the Auditor General, it's called the Controller and Auditor General of India, Supreme Audit Institution of India, before I moved into development work through the World Bank structure and now in the PEFA Secretariat. So in my own story, it goes back sometime a few years into government. I receive a mail, a letter rather, to say that I'm not nominated as a public financial management focal point to facilitate a World Bank's assessment of the country fiduciary accountability. And I was really shocked.
Yes.
You know why? Because I never heard of the word public financial management at that point of time. I was wondering, what is this PFM and how did I become a focal point? Only when I then tried to understand a bit more, whatever I have been doing in treasuries, in the Auditor General Office, from budget perspective, as a government accountant, all that together is nothing but public financial management, and that's what world calls us public financial management. And that took me into this trajectory, and the first comprehensive view of this entire picture of public financial management is something which I got through PEFA. PEFA is public expenditure and financial accountability. It's not a machine. It's not a program. It's simply a book which provides a framework. It's a framework with various questions on what a good budget preparation, a good budget execution, and a good budget evaluation is. So all this is put together in this book called PEFA, which is sponsored by several organizations, including Norway. NORAD represents Norway in the steering committee. It's a partnership of IMF, European Commission, World Bank, NORAD, Swiss. We have Luxembourg, Slovak Republic, and France. So they came together and maintain this framework as a global good practice. Why do they maintain this? Every country wants to do its budget well. But how do you say what is a good budget? How do you know what is a good practice in budget? So there are good practices in different countries pre-2000s. but there is no consistent view, globally accepted way to say that these are the public financial management good practices. And that's what PEFA did. That's what PEFA brought everyone together and said, these are the good practices. Today, PEFA is used in 156 countries to conduct PFM assessments and strengthen public financial management systems, both at national level and subnational level. And that would be my initial intro on what PEFA is.
Thank you very much. And it's also very interesting and good to know that you also worked in the SAI of India and that you are one of our own, if I can say so.
Maybe I should add that it's not just SAI of India. I worked in 3 SAIs. I worked in SAI India, in SAI Oman, and the USGAO. So it's 3. Quite a bit. I'm part of the community.
Yes, so spanning also 3 continents, which is quite impressive. I'm sure that not many can boast such a career, especially across SAIs. It's also very interesting what you mentioned about PEFA actually coming in as the benchmark, as the standard for what are good practices in public financial management. Of course, in the SAI world, we have the SAIs, the international standards for Supreme Audit Institutions, and they provide the standard. But of course, public financial management is much broader than just the external audit oversight. And that leads me to my next question, which is, in a nutshell, what are the main elements of the PEFA framework? If you open that book, what are you going to find? And also, I'm wondering, what are the main uses of the framework and of the report?
That's a great question. So if you take the framework and see the structure, it's into 7 pillars, means 7 aspects. One way to look at public finances is simply to say how to make a good budget, how to execute a good budget, and how to evaluate a budget. Then another way is to see into the PEFA pillars, which are actually various groups of PFM processes. The mother of all that, what we call as the first pillar, which is about having a reliable budget. Mm-hmm. Having a reliable budget has been probably about 600-700 years back in Netherlands is for the first time a budget which is presented to Parliament and which would be later audited came up. But some form of budgeting must be there all the time, ever since governments existed. As a kid, I read in one of the ancient, I think 300 BC Indian treatise called Ardhasastra by Kautilya. So where it says like how the government should prepare a budget. So it's always there. And at one level, the principles are the same. So you should tax well and collect well without hurting the citizen. At the same time, you should execute your budget without leakages, wastages, or exceeding the budget. So all this together simply boils down to the first pillar, which is having this credible budget. Are you able to execute your budget as you planned? Which means what? When as the parliament, as the legislature authorized the government to spend money, authorized the president, prime minister, finance ministers to spend money, did we do it or not? So that's the aggregation of all other pillars. Then you have various individual pillars. For example, management of assets and liabilities. Does government have enough processes in taking decisions on major capital investments? For example, you're trying to build a dam. What's the analysis? What's the socio-economic analysis from this? Or if it's a highway network with toll booths, what's the NPV IRR? Do you have a process to capture all this? And then if you make an asset, are you keep maintaining the asset very well? Mm-hmm. So for each of this, there would be parameters. So the way PEFA operates is each of these aspects of public finances are graded on a scale of A to D. So D being the lowest and A highest. What is seen as a basic level of global good practice is called C. So on each of in the whole framework, we have about 94 dimensions, and each of them are scored in these categories.
But before we go into the scoring and the methodology, you mentioned budget credibility, which basically means whether you have executed the budget according to the approved plan, is one of those main pillars and the main one. You also mentioned asset management. What about and public investment? What are the other 5 pillars?
So you have, if you go to the end, you have the accountability audit, the Supreme Audit Institutions auditing the financial statements and presenting to the legislature reviewing them, how well they do that. And then you have the whole of the budget execution pillar. How is public procurement done? How well are internal controls in the government to make sure that money is spent efficiently? I'm just sampling a few aspects of that. Then you have, do you prepare budgets based on on the policy direction? So do you have a kind of a macroeconomic forecast based on which you are making the revenue estimates? Are you preparing? Is there policy guidance structure very well embedded into it? That's the kind of an range of aspects that will be covered in the framework. And of course, transparency is one important. How transparent are public finances? Are you publishing? Say, for example, does really government budget, the way the government presents a budget in parliament, does it cover entire money of government or only part of money of government, right? So are there things outside the budget? So those are the kinds of questions. And the information, is it available? The budget document, what does it provide? Does it say how well you did in the budget previous year? And does it show the comparison? So these are the kinds of things which a good budget practice is normally expected to have based on global practices. And that's what the framework is structured around.
So it takes every major element of the public financial management cycle and assesses it.
Correct. At a it is at a kind of a very broad level. It doesn't. So that's where the difference between for example, SAI PMF as a performance management system framework comes. So we see the PEFA as the broad PFM framework for entire PFM. Basically, it doesn't leave out anything. Then each would have deep dive tools. So one of the deep dive tools, for example, is SAI PMF for Supreme Audit Institutions. Tax, you have TADAT, a tax administration diagnostic. So there are right now, recently, another anecdotal information. Recently, we did a small study. We tried to see what are the PFM tools available in the market. So we did a stock take. Can you guess how many tools are there in the world?
I don't know the exact number, but I'm pretty sure there is no shortage of assessment tools, because for the last 15 years, if there is one term that I have heard, it's assessment fatigue. So how many are there?
Good. As of 2019 end, December end, there were 64 tools identified.
On PFM aspects only?
Only PFM, and it's growing because tools are developed. So there are tools available in the market broadly.
And yet, PEFA remains, I would argue, the most important and the most widely implemented tool. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at least that this is how I would, if I were to be asked which tool is the most important one in public financial management, I would definitely say PEFA. And you mentioned SAI-PMF, which is a tool that is focused on measuring the performance of Supreme Audit Institutions, which was also actually modeled against the PEFA framework, precisely because of the fact that we know that PEFA functions very well and it's a very valuable assessment as such. But I also wanted to ask you now at this stage, maybe about the big picture in public financial management. And also, as you mentioned, PEFA assessments have been there for quite a while, starting in 2001.
Way back.
Way back. How many have been done so far? And I assume you have also done some cross-cutting analysis, which also makes me want to ask, what are the major trends, the major developments in public financial management? What's the big picture of PFM telling us right now?
Good. And thanks a lot for your appreciation of PIFA. We are very proud that PIFA is, and very glad that PIFA is making an impact. PIFA, because governments are doing repeated PIFAs to monitor PFM performance. That's one of the values of PIFA. You can plan your progress based on the scores. That's something which governments have been very happy about. And also that the fact that most of PIFA assessments these days are public. So it also indicates the level of willingness of ministries of finance, the interest of ministries of finance to be transparent about. Most of the assessments are done by the government and the development partner together, or governments themselves. We, the PEFA Secretariat, never will conduct an assessment. We are not involved in an assessment. We maintain the framework. We facilitate information, and PEFA is global public good. Anyone can pick up, even without consulting us, and conduct an assessment.
So anyone can do it and anyone can read the information? Is that what you're saying? It's publicly available?
Anyone can do it and decide whether they want to make
Publish.
it public or not. It's the right of the government to decide. The Ministry of Finance typically decides. The good news is, almost all reports these days, governments are intending to publish, and they're all coming up on the PEFA website. So that's the positive news about the level to which willingness of governments in moving ahead with that. Right now, we are just 2 reports less than 800 in the world. So
800 reports.
Yeah,
Wow.
so I think it's 798 or 797. I'm exactly not able to confirm, but which means we are going to celebrate the 800 reports. Now, if I go back to bigger picture, what's the bigger picture? If you add up all the PEFA assessment results, so a country doesn't have a score, only an aspect will have a score. But for theoretical purposes, you just academically add up all the scores, convert into a score. What do you think will be a global PFM score on A to D?
Okay, so let me go back to that because we didn't capture exactly the methodology as such. But from my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong here, PEFA scores at the level of different indicators, and each indicator is further structured down in dimensions.
You
Right?
got it absolutely right.
And then for each of those dimensions, there is a score from D, which is non-existent or very poorly performing, to
below basic level of performance. Whatever doesn't satisfy basic level of performance would be D. C is basic level of performance, and then you are increasing at the to B and A based on the level to which it's compliant with international practices.
Okay, so your question, I would probably guess, assuming that also the majority of PEFA assessments still cover public financial management systems in more of a developing country context, but not only, that I also
That's
know.
correct.
A C minus?
You're pretty close. It's a kind of, it would roughly be about C, which
About
means
C.
it's at basic level of performance. So that's the bigger picture. If you track all the scores over from the very first PEFA assessment, the good news is the PFM systems globally are improving, which means PEFA assessments and PFM reforms are working. And not only that, all the deep dive tools, TADAT, SAI, PMF, all other tools, they're working, because that's the reason why PFM systems are improving. That's the good news. So what's not so good news is the pace of improvement as much as one would expect? Perhaps no. Ideally, we should be faster. And then there are cases also where there'll be some aspects where they'll slide down also due to various reasons. So that's so you need to continuously invest on the PFM reforms and strengthen the systems to even maintain the current standing, and perhaps also try to reach a little bit higher scoring. Let me also give you a couple of individual aspects of global trends. Say, governments normally do pretty well at total money that they decided to spend, to collect and spend, and actual. So the aggregate level budget compliance is pretty okay worldwide. The problem is composition, which means you decide to give health ministry X amount, but end up giving something else, or you decide to. So this composition, what we call it as composition variance. So that's one area where things are not so great. Then you have also quite significant number of countries where government money is outside the budget.
Yes.
So it doesn't necessarily follow the PFM practices. That's a sort of a risk you have. And even if you take, for example, from an audit perspective, what we see is like the legislature looks at a budget from two angles. One, budget approval, and then the audit report, Auditor General. So the level to which, the rigor to which legislature, parliament looks at budget preparation, at approval, it doesn't give that rigor in the review of the audit report at the end. So why is it fair? I would argue that no.
No, but I'm sure that this will evoke some smiles and understanding and compassion from our auditors' audience, definitely, because most people would confirm your statement. And it's interesting that the data also clearly shows that.
The data establishes that it scored lower when it comes to legislature. And for that matter, audit report preparation and that aspects fare much higher than legislature making use of them and making recommendations. They score lower. So broadly, that's the kind of structure evolves. Then you have public procurement as an area where there are concerns, arrears. So government accrues arrears and doesn't maintain the arrears and control in many countries, which is quite a challenge in some countries. So it's a kind of areas of concern, but there are many bright spots. The bright spots is the budget preparation. Budget documentation has improved very significantly. One aspect which the data looks a little gives a message which may not be consistent with what everyone thinks. Say, these days, everyone talks of debt distress. Countries are going into debt challenges. Debt is very important. Paradoxically, from 2016 onwards, debt management scores in PEFA are going up.
So what would you say explains that paradox then?
That is the foundation. So that's PFM is the process. PFM informs policies and enables policy execution. So it's going to give the government all the opportunity for itself to run it, but there is a decision making going on. You can have a good debt management strategy and not follow it.
Yes.
And still engaged. Nobody can. It cannot stop just because you have fiscal rules and you don't follow them. Then obviously you will end up with higher debt. So that's the key there. So PFM gives you the tools to enable your public finances better. It doesn't make automatically. There are other things which need to add, including the political economy of reforms.
So the PEFA, would it then measure just the system, how it exists on paper, or will it also measure the actual practice? So to take your example, if everything is set up and structured with debt management as it should, if there is a debt management strategy and related policies in place, would PEFA capture only that, or would it also capture the practice of government not following what it has committed to?
That's a very good question. Let me take you back to something which is the fundamental principle of PEFA. PEFA informs policies and enables policy implementation, the framework. But what it doesn't do is assess the policy. So if you take that as the basis, for example, there is whether subsidy need to be given for agriculture. It's a government policy to give subsidy. Whether it is sustainable or not, it's eventually a decision. So how well the system is giving information to government to take a decision. That's what PEFA does. So there are aspects which are process related and aspects related which are actual implementation. Say, for example, budget reliability percentages, they are real. It is not just having a practice in place. The real numbers are compared. So it's a combination, but it wouldn't measure everything out of it. Let me give an audit example. What PEFA sees is, did the government accountant general prepare financial reports within, say, 3 months of the end of year and submit to audit? It will not check whether the report is prepared well. The financials, that is the role of auditor general
Yes.
to review that, right? So that's the logic with which it operates.
Okay, thank you. That was very useful also, I'm sure, for our audience to find out what is measured, and because you still touch upon it. And of course, the PEFA report has also a narrative that explains the finding, correct? So let me, before we go to the question of how SAIs can use the PEFA reports, could you tell us, if I am an interested reader and I have never seen a PEFA report, and I have one, and usually they're big reports, they're around 80, 100 pages maybe?
Sometimes more.
Sometimes more, sometimes more, yes. What should I be looking for? What should I first look at if I want to get an understanding of how the PFM system functions?
If you look at a PEFA report, there is a chart which shows up in a color-coded way the entire cycle. So it is designed in a way to, even for a kind of a lay person, when he or she looks at it, they should get a sense very quickly, are the overall PFM system strong or not? What is the level? So if you have a lot of darker, it means you are better. So that kind of a structure. So the bigger picture is quickly known. And then you have 3 budgetary outcomes. There are 3 goals of a good budget: aggregate fiscal discipline, allocative efficiency, is government allocating the money very well or not, and efficient service delivery. Is it enabling service delivery? That the money go to deliver goods and services to citizen. So the summary, the executive summary, presents an overview of the entire PFM system's impact on these 3 budgetary outcomes. And that is in a readable way for anyone even reasonably literate on public finances, or it's like, you can say, the citizen budget. So these days governments are issuing citizen budget.
Yes.
It is not meant for very people who understand finances. It's for the lay person, right? So this section is attempting to be also pitch it at that level. So it is to get the bigger picture. And then for experts, that would be on specific indicator, specific dimension under indicator, which is a more detailed aspect of measurement.
And now we reach to the point where I want to ask you about how would readers from an SAI, how should they approach the report? Are there some specific indicators that they would be more interested in? Some would argue that in this whole PFM cycle, SAIs are just a very small cogwheel. Is that so, actually? How does PEFA capture their work? And are there also other areas which you think are very important for SAIs to look at?
That's a great question. We very recently made an analysis around this. And actually, this week, I was here for the PEFA steering committee, as I mentioned. So this is one of the aspects, the SAIs, role of SAIs in the PFM is one of the aspects the steering committee members were reflecting upon, with the IDI Director General also participating and presenting in the steering committee. So if you look at what are the things default SI would love to look at it, it's intuitive that SI would look what is SI scored there, right? So there is one indicator out of the 31, indicator number 30, which is about size.
Okay.
So you look at like what are the standards being used, what are the audit reports produced, how is the independence of SI, those aspects are all covered there. So anybody would want to look at it. Then they would look at like how are these how is Parliament, legislature taking care of these audit reports? That probably SAIs would be default interested.
Yes, so PEFA has an indicator that measures the work of SAIs.
Absolutely.
Number 30. And then there is another one, which is about the parliamentary follow-up.
That's correct.
Okay.
And there is another indicator earlier in one of the earlier pillars, which also indicates performance evaluation. So the service delivery performance evaluation, performance audits by Supreme Audit Institutions are measured there, because that is a pillar that's an indicator which talks about essentially governments having a evaluation of a service delivery, right? So government can do it, its executive ministries can do it themselves. SAI can do an evaluation. Typically, what we see is both happen. Governments also institute their own evaluations. SAI does performance audits. All that gets assessed there.
And this is very interesting, that it is not just one indicator on its own, but rather that you can also see some reflection of the work of the SAI directly in the framework linked to other relevant aspects of the PFM system.
Absolutely. And I would argue that SAIs have a natural responsibility based on their mandate for the entire PFM. Because we even 20, 25, 30 years back, SAI's role in internal control is very well established in eSAIs. And so PFM is a kind of a more expansive, clearer way of talking about this whole process, right? So to that extent, and I see from in the last 5 to 7 years, the level to which Supreme Audit Institutions are focusing on PFM systems is very significant. And that takes me to this question of an opportunity. So a SAI in a country wants to do a review of PFM systems. One doesn't need to reinvent. You adapt the framework's structure to suit your requirements and use it as public good. It's up there in the website. You don't need to ask anyone. And it's all, the framework is developed after intense international consultation, that there is no more an argument about is it a good practice or not. Only the good practices are in the framework. So that's an opportunity. And perhaps there are also, like, any SAI, every year when a reports of PEFA comes, usually recommended frequency is 3 to 4 years. But every audit planning cycle, I would say that SAI should read the PEFA report of the country in the promises, identify, for example, how is public procurement getting scored? What are the controls of public procurement? How are the controls relating to, arrears accumulation, commitment controls? You get already a snapshot as an input for our audit planning purposes. So it's across the board. SAI is itself an indicator, as I mentioned, and SAI has a responsibility much beyond, across everything, as the key accountability or institution of the country.
Thank you very much. And this is really, I think you made a number of very important points here. First, that this wealth of knowledge that has been generated through the PEFA assessment, both in terms of creating the framework and making sure that it works, that it is solid, that it applies in different contexts, that work has been done, and that is available also for SAIs to use, but also, of course, that the data is already there and it can inform so much in terms of the SAI's own planning work. And in fact, I'm just coming back from a workshop with a number of SAIs on strategic planning, so crafting their overall strategic plan. And it is one of the underlying information sources that we suggested to them to keep in mind the most recent PEFA assessment, besides, of course, making sure that they understand where their own strengths and weaknesses. An SAI has a role to play in the public financial management system, but in the context of limited resources, and of course, let's be honest, every public institution, or most of them, have limited resources and less than what they would want. It's so important to be strategic about where to focus your work, which areas you should capture in your audits, you should capture in follow-up reports, in which areas you should engage even beyond that. Just to give you one example, one SAI is currently in the context of an introduction of IPSAS, the public sector accounting standards are being rolled out in the country. So, of course, the SAI sees that it has an important role to play there even before it starts auditing the financial statements. It's more about how do you make sure that this process actually works within that context. And I think in that regard, the PEFA framework and the assessments can be invaluable in terms of information. So you mentioned already a number of indicators and aspects that are particularly relevant for SAIs, such as public procurement. You mentioned arrears. Also earlier, you talked about extra budgetary funds, in some cases also called constituency development funds. This is a usual and typical way to call those funds which are a bit off the budget and where SAIs usually don't have the mandate to audit. Are there other parts of the PEFA framework which you think might be particularly relevant for SAIs and where there is also scope for SAIs to look further, which may not be captured by them sufficiently right now?
Probably one thing I would specifically mention would be the alignment of national budget with medium-term plans. So in a typical developing country, based on my experiences globally, what I see is the whole process caters to multiple groups. So each ministry makes its sector plan.
Yes.
And then there is a national plan. Sometimes the sector plan and national plan doesn't talk.
Often, I would say.
And then there is a medium-term expenditure framework that may not talk to either national plan or and then the medium-term framework may not talk to the budget. So this whole structure, when it is not working, then the challenge on overall PFM would be like in that kind of a scenario, if you are actually implementing advanced reforms, say you want to implement program budgeting or ipsos accrual for financial statements, these are advanced reforms. So if you need program budgeting, your cash management should be very good. Predictability of cash should be there. In some cases, Parliament may authorize a budget, but in reality, the projections of cash flows are so erratic that the budget director decides every fortnight which bills to pay. Then what is the overall authorization environment? So SAIs can play a very significant role in contributing through performance audits on how to strengthen this whole system. Budget is always a kind of a statement of intention, so statement of doing good things. There is a little bit of an optimism bias which I see in many countries, which is acceptable. Budgets do that, but it should not be abnormal. So then the whole process is vitiated.
We like to say head in the sky, feet on the ground.
Absolutely.
If only it was so easy to capture that level of realism, of course. Now I would like to ask you if we can shift our focus towards some of the most relevant topics on the entire development agenda nowadays. I think they go beyond budgets, even if budgets are, of course, the vehicle to realize and to address those topics. I think some of the most exciting and important work coming out of the PEFA Secretariat in recent years has been connected to the development of the PEFA gender and also PEFA climate assessments. Could you say a bit more about those?
The logic is, if you don't have something on budget, you can't execute it. So if governments say we are interested in climate, if governments say we want to promote gender equity, and budgets don't talk about it, it means that's only a talk. It's not going to get executed. So you need to get it on budget. So that's the basic principle which triggered this thinking on these two very important emerging policy expectations of globally across countries. So what it does is, the PEFA climate has been just endorsed, the final version, a couple of months earlier by the steering committee after piloting in 20 countries. So the PEFA climate is a framework for assessing how responsive your budget system is for climate, which would mean, for example, are you able to track climate expenditure through either tagging or any other mechanism, just for example, or is the procurement system climate responsive, right? So these are the kinds of things which you are dovetailing into the budget process itself, so that they automatically would take care. With gender has been, PIFA gender has been there for a couple of years. Again, the principle is quite similar. So is the budget really gender responsive? Do you have sex disaggregated data available? And do you have the budget call circular, which is asking for budget proposals from various line ministries to consolidate and present to the parliament? Does it take into ask for the right information to make a gender responsive budget? Does Parliament, when it reviews, does it look at this information? These are the kinds of questions which are asked in the PIFA gender. So based on PIFA gender has been used in close to 40, we have nearly 40 reports right now. So there are already trends we see. There are quite expected trends. For example, there is some level of sex disaggregated data collection or budget circulars being reasonable. At the same time, legislature never looks at it, right, in many cases. So they score low on that. So it means like on the gender budget side, the story we see is efforts from government are being made, which is wonderful.
Yes.
The good effort means information is available. Is it being used in taking the right next step? There the story is mixed. There are some very brilliant success stories already there globally, but obviously it is quite at a nascent stage. These two areas are quite at nascent stage, and over time what we expect is the storyline to completely converge. You cannot necessarily have a gender responsive or climate responsive budget distinct from budget itself, because there's only one budget.
Yes.
There are no three budgets, right? So that should be, that culturally that needs to be into the government system, be so much integrated, and we see that trend happening. That's triggering it. It is still slow, but we hope that it will be faster in future.
I mean, knowing the current emphasis and focuses on sustainability as, of course, the broader encompassing topic, I would very much suspect that we will see indeed more of a push to integrate both gender and climate aspects in the actual budget process and not as a, let's say, add-on. I think that's
true. And let me tell you what happens when they have this. When this information is there, the biggest impact is everybody will know within the government. Right now, even within governments, people do not know, because budget doesn't talk gender. Doesn't. Once that is in, there may be a gap between taking right actions and just having information, but it's a matter of time. Once the data speaks, information is right there. So the advocacy part of it would also strongly take, and the actions would also get accelerated, we are already seeing trends. We made a compilation of, after a PIFA gender, what are the kinds of steps in various countries. Some examples they were very nice examples where they consciously took improvement steps in for greater gender equality. I wouldn't say that it's as good as the overall budget. As far as when PIFA is there, the steps they take to improve PFM systems, whether through IFMIS systems or treasury single account, I'll not bother with too many of technical terms, but those steps are giant steps governments have taken, and big steps have led to good results. On gender and climate, I personally see them still as baby steps, and to speed up they need to move in from teenage, and they need to go into an they need to take their strides.
I very much hope that it would still happen during our time, that we will see this acceleration, because of course the times are quite critical when it comes to both those aspects. And I wonder if I can ask you also a follow-up question here, wearing my SAI hat, because SAIs, they also have been doing performance audits of both gender, and with a gender lens. It can be linked to things like gender-based violence, it can be linked to gender equality, and so on. They have also been doing, I think, increasingly environmental audits and performance audits with a, let's say, sustainability and climate focus. How do those fit into are they captured in some way through the PEFA gender and also through the PEFA climate assessments? And how do they compare? Do you know, actually, do you have a view on that?
They very much are captured. So that's the beauty of it. So even the PEFA climate framework itself cites the example of Bangladesh SAIs performance audit manual for environment as a good practice example in the framework itself. So it is like the gender and climate aspects work by SAIs becomes extremely important, because eventually on accountability side, SAI and only SAI is the most critical national institution to make it happen. And that is something which SAIs have been taken into SAI, and all the regional groups have taken it very seriously and taking action. So I would expect that it is only going to grow up. We are seeing like the Ipsos board soon releasing the sustainability reporting standards, right? So auditors have to respond with how to audit the sustainability reporting. So the future is pretty clear, the direction in which we are going. And that's where I would say SAIs need to invest effort, resources to strengthen their capacity also, because these are nascent areas. A traditional SAI, I wouldn't have known. When I was in Ministry of Finance and Government of India, I never knew a lot of these aspects. In SAI, we heard, because then by the time there were these initial stages, but this is fast evolving storyline. And more training, and the role of IDI is very, very important there in creating the right kind of an environment across all the INTOSAI members, and going down to individual technical auditors and strengthening them to be able to face the reality of greater expectations on these audits.
Thank you. And I think it's very important also to mention that even beyond the auditors, of course, working with the entire organization of the SAI is so important. And you mentioned sustainability reporting. And actually, we had a couple of episodes of this very podcast on the topic of sustainability reporting, but also from the perspective of what can the SAI as an organization do in relation to sustainability reporting. How about the SAI's own sustainability reporting? And there we had a very interesting conversation with the Deputy Auditor General of South Africa, who was explaining about their own journey of planning and strategizing for sustainability, of course, in their audit work, but also in terms of the organization, being conscious of things like how much carbon emissions are we actually responsible for when we send our auditors out in the field? What about gender pay gaps, which are also part of this whole huge area? And it's very interesting, of course, then to see how PEFA looks at it from the perspective of the entire PFM system and how that is taken up on a macro level. And thank you very much also for emphasizing the important role that SAIs can play in that, and that they are already actually probably at the forefront in terms of capturing such issues in many
Absolutely,
respects.
including the recent climate scanner initiative of INTOSAI working group on environmental audit. The steps are huge. I was actually mentioning on the other day in a UN conference where the climate scanner was launched in New York, that like where do SAIs get data to populate the climate background? For example, one quick source, wherever there is a PEFA climate, there is an inception questionnaire filled by government. Data readily available, publicly available on the website. Take it and use it. It's just trying to pick what is around and then build upon that is what I was recommending there in that conference.
Yes, indeed. We live in the world where data is probably the most readily available thing that we can get hold of. Great. Now, moving towards the end of our discussion, which is very interesting, and definitely we can explore many of those topics in much greater detail. But I don't want to take up too much of your time because, again, it's Friday afternoon here in Oslo for our audience, and it's been a very, very busy week. So I wanted to ask you, as always, we end up with asking our guests to give their views and their perspective on SAIs and what is happening in the world of SAIs. And I want to ask you a specific question. We live in a world, and the recent data, has shown quite clearly that there is democratic backsliding happening across contexts, across countries, both developed and developing ones. Unfortunately, it's not moving in the right direction overall. And we have seen that this has affected, in many cases, also SAIs. And there is data that also confirms that the independence of the SAI, the actual independence of the SAI, is more and more under threat. And taking, of course, the perspective of PEFA and of the holistic PFM system, I was wondering what would be your advice for how SAIs can safeguard their independence and really make the most out of their role in their PFM system?
That's a very, very important point you made. Independence is so fundamental and foundational for SAIs that if that is affected, it will in all probability affect most of the effectiveness of SAI. So it's very important to protect that. I see it from two perspectives. First, the brighter side of it. Fortunately, the way constitutional and legal provisions globally have been already formulated is reassuring, because generally in many countries there are reasonably strong safeguards in favor of protecting SAI independence. So I believe that it would not go down so badly in a dramatic fashion, despite what is happening elsewhere. At the same time, the reality is that there are pressures, and the pressures would continue. And these pressures need to be, the responsibility is twofold. One, SAIs definitely need to be proactive, to be aware of what risks they are facing. There are good international innovations, for example, the IDI's rapid advocacy mechanism and few other things. And even, for example, a PEFA assessment score shows a C or a D. Say a D, it actually means on that particular dimension, that is PI 34 on SAI independence, 30.4 SAI independence, it means the independence is quite under stress, right? So that's a message for straight away an indicator to take action. So the advocacy and the kind of an efforts from SAI definitely need to be up. But I would also look at it as it's not just the SAI's responsibility. It is the country's responsibility, and it's the world's responsibility to have independent, credible Supreme Audit Institutions in every country. There need to be this interaction. For example, in government there should be champions, advocates who would work to against resisting any tendencies from some quarters, even within the government, to say that, okay, so that needs to be, and it's a reality. Every government has various viewpoints and different experiences as such. Then the world need to work there. So the INTOSAI is doing great, IDI is doing a lot of steps, and that it need to only grow up to give the kind of an overall framing where everyone plays their role. For example, civil society organizations have a role, media has a role. So development partners, when they discuss in developing countries, let's take, for example, any development partner. Many development partners, there's this question of like, they do not want to put money in the government budget. They want to have a separate structure, which is because it simply indicates in that particular case less confidence on the government system. But even in those, so the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness always said you need to try to, as much as possible, put in government systems. You can't undermine the systems by having parallel systems. You need to strengthen the systems and use the government systems. One of the first government system which any development partner typically would like to use is audit by Supreme Audit Institution of the donor-funded projects, right? So the strengthening that, so there is this interaction. Even the development partners' money is ensured that it is put to use. The accountability comes by having an independent auditor general who is overseeing most of the cases these days. Development aid is mixed up with country funding. So you cannot necessarily isolate and do the, you need to look at the entire budget and in which development aid is part of it. So that would be my take. So everyone needs to play their role. SAIs definitely have a key role to be proactive, but it is everybody's jobs. It is the job of everyone who wants good governance in the world, in every country. We need to play our role. And PEFA is very keen to play the role. The steering committee has endorsed a view that we operate in phases. We just started the phase 6, a 5-year period of phase 6. In this phase, SAI and parliaments are priority areas for PEFA Secretariat to provide extensive support, whatever the way it's needed to strengthen PFM systems.
This is a very exciting new development and message, I'm sure, for everybody from our SAI audience. Srini, once again, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. A lot to learn from you. I'm sure it's been very interesting for our audience as well. All the best to you in the next upcoming phase of the PEFA Secretariat's implementation work. Looking forward to hearing more in terms of findings and in terms of developments coming out of PEFA and of the data that you are analyzing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for being such a wonderful host. And in a PEFA lingo, I would give you A. Thank you.
Thank you very much.